Hey Jammers, this is the second part of the video from earlier this week. Earlier this week I did the line art for Mermaid Vogue. Today we're doing the coloring. The link is in the description below, so let's jump right in. Alright, so right here you'll see that the line art is different from what I ended on in the last video. When I came back to do the coloring, I didn't like the way the pose was, so I just fixed it and now I like it. Here I'm making my main clipping mask underneath my line art layer. I've talked a lot in my previous videos how to make a clipping mask, but what I'm doing for my fill color is I'm using this bright green color because I'm using warmer tone colors and like reds and oranges, and so that way I'll be able to tell a lot easier if I haven't colored in a part of my my piece because of the green contrasting with the red tones. I'm using a dark auburn color for the hair, and the skin tone is this dark tannish color. You can see here I went underneath onto my fill layer and went to erase some of the area and accidentally drew a little bit on that fill layer. Just making sure I've got all of the skin colored in. You'll notice that in areas where there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of stuff that rubs up against two different colors, I'm not filling that in right away because right now I'm just doing my color blocking, and then I'll go back in later and zoom in and be much more careful and fill in those areas. The tail is this reddish coral color. Here I am filling the area in. And then the fins are going to be a nice orange color, just because I think that'll be a little bit more interesting, but also lend itself to the idea that the fin is a little bit thinner and a little bit more transparent than the tail. And here I believe I'm going to color in the rock. I'm doing a very dark tone on the rock because when I do the shading, I'm going to put the highlights in, and then when I blend them out, it'll have a nice, very textured look. The rope, I'm doing just a slightly lighter variation of the skin color, trying to keep my color palette fairly limited. And then in here, I'm going in and coloring the details on the face. And then I'm going to go in and do the details on the hair. Trying to be very careful not to get it onto the other color, but you'll still have to go in and take care of it because I did get some on the ear there. And then I'm going to go in and finish up right here on the edge of the scalp. And then I believe I'm going to go in and do the eyes. So here I accidentally picked the wrong color, and now I'm going in and filling the eyes in that nice glassy blue color. I really wanted these eyes to look inspired by deep sea creatures. And you'll notice that the whites of the eyes aren't actually white in my photo, and that's just because when you're in a darker environment, your eyes don't look bright white. So if you color them in bright white when you're doing a darker, more diffuse shading, they'll stand out and look just really weird in a piece. So what I'm doing here is each of my different color areas are going to have their own individual clipping mask over top of the original clipping mask. Because that way they're all on separate layers, and when I'm doing my shading and my blending, they don't bleed the colors together. You'll notice you're seeing these messy lines pop out. That's because on my original clipping mask, when I'm coloring in, all the brush strokes outside of the lines, outside of the clipping mask, are still there. Photoshop is just hiding them because of the clipping mask. So when I do my magic wand select of my color, it selects all those brush strokes. So when I want to create the clipping mask, I have to do the new fill layer over everything else, and then I have to select the area outside of my line art and delete the color that is spread around the outside like I'm about to do here. You'll see how messy that is. I select around the line art on the line art layer in just a moment, and then it's all nice and cleaned up. You'll also notice that all of my clipping mask layers for my shading I'm naming, so I know what's where. I don't always do this, but when I have a lot of different layers like this, I like to try and name them just so it's easier to tell. In here, I'm doing the shading for the hair. Now, normally underwater, you can't really tell, especially with really dark hair, you can't really tell the difference in all these highlights and shadows and stuff, but I wanted to do a very subtle version of highlights and shadows on the hair just because it gave it a little bit more movement. If I just left it that big color block, it kind of felt kind of boring and didn't read as well. So I did a very subtle amount of shading. And then here I'm about to do the shading on the skin. The color, the way I pick my shading for most colors is I go into the color picker, select the color that I had for my base color, and then when I want a darker color for the shadows, I just go down and to the right a little bit until I get a color that I like in that same color palette. And then for the lighter colors, I just go from the base shade up and to the left till I'm where I want it to be. And you'll see I'm about to very much diffuse this shading, just because when you're underwater, um, the light gets refracted. So the shadows are a little bit more subtle. They might not even be as strong as they are in this piece, sometimes depending on where you are and how the light looks, but I wanted to have enough um, shadow and contrast there that you could, see the depth and see the dimension of the character. And then in here, I'm going to go in and do the shading on the face. And as well, if you're in a very you want a very harsh lighting situation, instead of shading with the same color and same shade, you can shade in the darkest areas um, with like a purple color and just lower the opacity on that and blend it out. And then in your darkest areas, it'll seem much, much more dramatic and much more contrasting. But for this purpose, I just wanted it very diffuse. See here, I'm picking a very light color compared to my skin tone for these highlights, just blocking in where I want the light to kind of be hitting. And then I'm going to very much diffuse those highlights. I want them to be very soft, just enough that you can see that there's depth to the character. So, and in a previous video, I mentioned that what I do is normally called soft shading. I do more of what is like a halfway between cell shading and soft shading, but it works pretty well. It gets the idea across. Um, and I don't do full soft shading just because it doesn't usually look right with the style of line art I do on my digital pieces. Here I'm taking the same color from the tail and adding some color to the face so that fin detail on the ear and then adding some nice blush to the cheeks. I'm going to pretty much completely diffuse that out because I just want it to warm up the skin a little bit in that area. And then in here I'm using the color on the lips. I just shaded the upper lip a little bit darker and I'm putting a bit of a highlight on the lower lip to give them a little bit more dimension. And here I'm going to be adding the scales to her chest. So instead of doing a swimsuit piece, I wanted it to look like the scales from her tail kind of come up her back and create like a natural swimsuit. So I'm using the same color from the tail and creating this swimsuit shape around her top of her body. And then in a moment here, I'm going to stipple in the shadow colors on the swimsuit piece. And what stippling is what I'm doing here is these little dots and everything to give the idea of shading rather than soft shading. And then a highlight on the top where the light would be hitting it. So you'll see when I go in and do the scales on fish are one of the few exceptions underwater that you can see really the highlights and the shadows, and you can see how they glint and glimmer in the sun. Just because, evolutionarily speaking, those bright flashy colors and how it sparkled in the sun under the water really helped with finding mates. So you'll see I'm adding a very bright, shiny highlight onto the tail, just to give that idea of the fish scales. And I use the stippling idea as well because it really gives the idea of how light catches on fish. There are other ways you can do it, and I know there are some people like I've seen that do like really like hyper realistic work that like go in and will do like individual scales on things, but I'm fine with just my stippling here. In here, I'm going to do a little bit of shading on the rope, just subtle, just to give it a little bit of dimension, but it's not a focal point, and it's very tiny overall on the piece, so I didn't put too much emphasis on it. And in here, I'm going to put this very bright, in the same color tone as the color of the rock, but very bright highlight where the light would be hitting the rock for the most part. And then I'm going to blend it out, and I'm going to do a very rough blend so that it gives it a nice texture. So as you can see here, just adding that one color and doing a little bit of blending, added some dimension, added some contrast. I'm going to fill in that shadow, and then I believe I'm going to be merging all these layers and putting a transparent, just blue color overlay over the whole piece to make it look like it's underwater. But that's pretty much it. I'll let you finish watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And as always, have a very good day.